I was turning 25 at the most expensive restaurant in the city, surrounded by people who loved me conditionally, and the man I loved was standing outside in the rain because my mother had pointed at the door and told him he wasn't worth the chair. She said it quietly, with a smile, the kind of smile that has been practiced so long it no longer knows it's cruel. She said, "This isn't the right setting for you, sweetheart." She was talking to Daniel. She was talking to the son of the man who owned the building we were standing in. She just didn't know that yet. My name is Serena Voss. I am 25 years old, and on the night of my birthday dinner, the owner of a 5-star restaurant walked across his own dining room floor, stopped in front of my mother, and bowed, not to her, to the boy she had just thrown out. My mother's wine glass hit the floor. That sound, crystal on marble, the crack and scatter, is the sound I hear every time someone tells me that money and class are the same thing. They are not the same thing, not even close. Welcome to Calm Drama Stories, where ordinary people set quiet boundaries that change everything. Here, dignity always outlasts cruelty, and the truth has a way of arriving exactly when it's supposed to. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and stay with me. This one has been waiting to be told. Let me tell you about the family I grew up in. My father, Richard Voss, is a partner at a mid-sized law firm in Charlotte, North Carolina. He drives a Lexus, belongs to 2 golf clubs, and has the deep, even tan of a man who takes 4 vacations a year and calls all of them business trips. He is 57 years old, well-liked in professional circles, and deeply committed to the idea that appearances are not just important, they are, in a meaningful sense, everything. My mother, Catherine Voss née Whitmore, is what certain women in Charlotte call a presence. She chairs charity committees. She attends gallery openings. She knows the maitre d' at every restaurant worth knowing by first name, and she refers to this as social capital, which she considers as real and as spendable as the other kind. She is 54, beautiful in the precise, maintained way of a woman who has never once let herself be seen without effort, and she is the most skilled person I have ever met at making cruelty sound like concern. I have a sister, Audrey, who is 28 and has spent her entire adult life perfecting the particular skill of becoming whatever the room requires. She married a finance analyst named Bryce 2 years ago in a wedding that cost more than most people's mortgages, and she has since settled into a version of our mother's life with the determination of a woman who has mistaken inheritance for achievement. I love my family. I want to be clear about that. I love them the way you love something that shaped you before you understood it was shaping you, with complicated loyalty and clear eyes. But I also know them, and knowing them means knowing this. In the Voss family, a person's value was calibrated by a specific set of coordinates. Where did you go to school? What does your family do? What neighborhood did you come from? And what does your car say about you when you pull up to the valet? These were not stated values, they were assumed ones. The kind that live in the silences at dinner tables, and the expressions people make when you say someone's last name and they do a split-second search of their mental database. I had spent 25 years learning to read those silences. Daniel Ashworth did not fit the coordinates, not because of who he was, because of how he appeared, and in my family, the appearance was the whole case. I met Daniel on a Tuesday morning in October, 14 months before my birthday dinner.
I was at the campus library at UNC Charlotte, finishing the last semester of my master's in communications. I had 3 papers due in 2 weeks, a thesis defense in 4, and the specific fraying energy of a person who has been running on black coffee and ambient stress for so long, they've forgotten what calm feels like. He was sitting 2 tables away from me, reading something that looked like it was printed in a foreign language. I found out later it was an architectural theory text in Italian, which he read for what he called hobby purposes, which tells you something about him. He was not the most conventionally striking person in the room. He was average height, lean, with the particular kind of quietness about him that some people mistake for shyness, and others, if they're paying attention, recognize as self-containment. He wore a dark green jacket that looked old and well-loved. He had a coffee cup with no logo on it. He was taking handwritten notes, which, in a room full of laptops, made him look either old-fashioned or interesting, depending on your disposition. I knocked a stack of books off the table. Not a small stack, an architectural stack. 5 books and a binder in a library at 10 a.m. The sound was tremendous. Every head in the room turned. He looked up, our eyes met across the mutual mortification of the moment, and then he did something that I have thought about many times since. He didn't smirk. He didn't look away politely. He just looked at me with steady, calm attention, the way you look at something that has your full interest. And then he stood up, walked over, and started picking up books without being asked. He handed them back to me one at a time, reading the titles as he went. He said, Journalism Ethics, Media Law, 2 Press Freedom Histories, and, he turned the last one over, a biography of Katharine Graham. He looked up. You're thorough. I said, I'm panicking, but I appreciate the reframe. He smiled. It was a quiet smile, the kind that lives in the eyes before it reaches the mouth. He went back to his table. I stared at my books for 10 minutes before I did any work. 2 days later, he was there again. Same table, same handwritten notes. I had come back specifically because I told myself the library was the best place to work, and not because I was hoping he would be there. He was there. This time I sat one table closer. By the end of the week, we were sitting at the same table, working in the comfortable silence of 2 people who don't need to fill space. He walked me to my car on Friday afternoon. We stood in the parking lot for 45 minutes talking about things I no longer remember the specifics of, but remember the quality of. The easy, unguarded conversation of people who have recognized something in each other and are taking their time being sure of it. He called me that Sunday. We had our first proper date the following Thursday. Coffee that turned into dinner that turned into a walk along the waterfront that turned into standing outside my apartment at midnight talking about cities we'd never been to, which felt like a promise. I knew by the 3rd week. I didn't say it for 3 months, but I knew. Here is what I knew about Daniel Ashworth in those first months. He was 27, he had done his undergraduate degree in London, architecture, which explained the Italian texts. He had moved to Charlotte 14 months prior for reasons he described as a change of direction, which I understood at the time as vague and later understood as precise. He worked, when I asked, for a property development firm, which I took to mean a mid-level office job, and he never corrected me on. He lived in an apartment in Noda, the arts district, a 1-bedroom in an older building with good light and a bookshelf that covered an entire wall, and a kitchen where he cooked with the focused, unhurried attention he brought to everything. The apartment was not expensive. The furniture was good but worn. He drove a 4-year-old Honda that needed a new bumper sticker removed. He paid for dinner when we went out and deflected when I tried to split it, not in a performative way, but in the manner of someone for whom the gesture was natural and the amount was genuinely irrelevant. I noticed this but didn't think much of it. He was generous. That was the only conclusion I drew. He did not talk about money. He did not talk about his family much. When I asked, he said, "My father and I are in the middle of something complicated." He said it without drama, the way you describe a long, ongoing process. Not a wound, not a war, just a negotiation that had been running for a while. I understood complicated family things. I had some of my own. What I did not know, his father was Elliot Ashworth, the Elliot Ashworth, founder of Ashworth Group, a real estate development company headquartered in Charlotte with holdings across 12 states and a portfolio that included, among many other things, the historic former textile building that had been converted into the city's premier 5-star dining destination, Loom, the restaurant where my mother would, 14 months later, tell his son he wasn't good enough for the chair he was sitting in. I did not know any of this. Daniel had not told me. I found out indirectly, in a manner I will describe shortly, and when I did, I understood the complicated in a way that changed everything. But first, my parents had to meet him. My parents met Daniel for the first time in December, 6 weeks after Daniel and I had quietly, unambiguously acknowledged that this was serious. I arranged it carefully. Sunday brunch at a restaurant my mother liked. Not too formal, neutral territory, the kind of place where the Eggs Benedict arrived on slate tiles and the orange juice was freshly pressed, and my mother could hold court without feeling like she was a guest somewhere else's court. I told Daniel beforehand, my family is particular, my mother especially. Just be yourself and don't take the bait if she goes fishing. He said, "What kind of fishing?" I said, "The kind where she asks what your father does and then recalibrates her entire opinion of you based on the answer." He said, "What if I don't answer?" I said, "That might be worse." He thought for a second. Then he said, "I'll figure it out." He was wearing the dark green jacket again. I had come to understand this jacket was his version of armor, not because it was impressive, but because he was comfortable in it, and comfort, for Daniel, was a form of security that didn't need anyone else's validation. My mother's eyes went to the jacket immediately. A half-second read, filed, conclusion drawn. My father stood up and shook Daniel's hand and said, "Glad to meet you, son." He said it warmly, but with the particular cadence of a man who has already decided where to rank you and is being gracious about it. Audrey was there with Bryce. Bryce spent 30 seconds establishing that he worked in finance and then asked Daniel what he did. Daniel said, "Property development." Bryce said, "Oh, which firm?" Daniel said, "It's a smaller outfit, you probably haven't heard of it." Bryce nodded slowly, the nod of a man recalibrating downward. My mother asked where he'd gone to school. He said, "Undergrad in London, UCL." This gave her a moment's pause. London was points, UCL was more points, but then she said, "And your family's in Charlotte?" He said, "My father is, yes." "And what does he do?" And Daniel looked at her for a moment with those steady, self-contained eyes and said, "He's in real estate." My mother said, "How nice." 2 words. The 2 words that in my mother's vocabulary meant below acceptable, moving on. She turned to ask Bryce about a charity golf tournament his firm was sponsoring. Daniel ate his Eggs Benedict and spoke when spoken to, and was, in every observable measure, gracious and calm. He complimented the food. He asked my father a question about a local development project that prompted a 20-minute discussion about Charlotte's zoning laws, during which my father was clearly surprised by Daniel's knowledge and then, predictably, found a way to end the conversation without acknowledging the surprise. In the car on the way home, Daniel said, "Your mother has already decided." I said, "I know, I'm sorry." He said, "Don't apologize for her. She's consistent. That's almost a virtue." I laughed in spite of myself. He reached over and took my hand. He said, "It doesn't change anything." I believed him. The 7 months between December and my birthday in July were the best months I have had. I finished my thesis and defended it in March. Daniel sat in the 3rd row during the defense, the only person there who wasn't a faculty member or a fellow student, wearing a gray sweater and reading the program with genuine interest. When it was over, he brought me flowers, not a performative bouquet, but a bunch of wildflowers and brown paper that he'd gotten from the farmer's market that morning and carried across campus on the bus because he'd taken the bus that day and didn't want to bother with parking. I cried a little. I told him it was stress release from the defense. He said, "It can be both things." I started a job in April, communications coordinator for a nonprofit focused on urban development advocacy. The work was meaningful and underpaid and genuinely interesting, the combination that defines most good early career jobs. Daniel was unreservedly supportive in the particular way of someone who has never needed to compete with your success, who finds your wins straightforwardly good because he is not keeping score. We settled into the rhythms of a real relationship. I cooked badly, and he cooked well, and we ate together most evenings at his apartment or mine. We went to farmers markets on Saturday mornings. We drove to Asheville one weekend in April when the mountains were still winter cold, and walked trails and found a bookstore and ate dinner at a place with 12 seats and no menu, just whatever the kitchen had made that day. He called his father once a month. I knew this because he would sometimes disappear for an hour on a Sunday evening and come back quieter than he left, not upset exactly, but carrying something, the complicated thing, still in progress.
I did not ask details he hadn't offered. He would tell me when he was ready. I trusted that. In May, he took me to a gallery opening for a photographer he knew vaguely through a mutual contact. The gallery was in a converted warehouse space. Good crowd, the specific energy of people who care about art and are also excited about free wine. We were looking at a photograph, a long exposure shot of a building demolition, the implosion caught mid-fall, this strange frozen violence, when a man across the room looked up and went still. He was in his early 60s, silver-haired, well-dressed without being ostentatious, with the build of someone who had been athletic for a long time. He had Daniel's eyes, exactly Daniel's eyes, that same particular quality of still, complete attention. He looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at him. Neither of them moved for about 4 seconds. Then Daniel said quietly to me, "I need to... 1 minute." He walked across the room. They spoke for about 10 minutes near the far wall, too far for me to hear, but close enough to watch. Their body language was not warm, but it wasn't cold either. It was careful. The body language of people who are in the middle of a negotiation they both want to resolve, and neither has yet figured out how. The older man glanced over at me once. I didn't look away. He held my gaze for a moment with those same eyes, then returned to the conversation. When Daniel came back, he said, "That was my father." I said, "I know." He looked at me. I said, "You have the same eyes." He was quiet for a moment. I said, "Do you want to tell me the complicated thing?" He looked at the photograph, the building suspended in its own falling. He said, "Not tonight, but soon." I said, "Okay." We looked at the photograph together for another minute. He said, "He wants to have dinner, the 3 of us, when you're ready." I said, "I'm ready whenever you are." He nodded. He took my hand. We went to look at the rest of the exhibition. He told me 3 weeks later. We were at his apartment on a Sunday evening. He had made pasta, something with brown butter and sage that he claimed required no skill, and actually required considerable skill. And we were sitting at his small kitchen table with a bottle of wine and the particular ease of a Sunday that has been used well. He said, "I should tell you about my father." I said, "Okay." He said, "His name is Elliot Ashworth." I sat with that for a moment. I knew the name. Most people in Charlotte who paid any attention to the city's development landscape knew the name. Ashworth Group, 12 states, major mixed-use developments, historic preservation projects, hospitality holdings. I had written about one of their urban development initiatives for a class paper 18 months earlier. I said, "Elliot Ashworth, who founded Ashworth Group?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Your father is one of the wealthiest developers in the Southeast?" He said, "Yes." I looked at him carefully. He was looking back at me with the same expression he always had, steady, waiting, not performing anything, not shame, not pride, just openness. I said, "And you have been living in a Noda 1-bedroom with a 4-year-old Honda." He said, "The car needs a new inspection sticker, actually. I keep forgetting." I said, "Daniel." He said, "I know. Let me explain." He explained. 4 years ago, he and his father had a significant disagreement. The details were personal to both of them, and I'm not going to share the specifics here because they don't belong to me and they don't belong to this story. What I will tell you is the shape of it. Elliot Ashworth had wanted Daniel to come into the business directly after university, to take a path that had been pre-designed. Daniel had wanted to find his own way in, to understand the work from the ground up, to earn a real position rather than inherit a title. The disagreement had become a distance. Not a permanent rupture, they still spoke, still loved each other in the complicated way of fathers and sons who are too similar to agree on everything, but a deliberate separation. Daniel had come to Charlotte 14 months ago specifically to work at a subsidiary of Ashworth Group in an entry-level capacity, under a different name, so he could learn the business without anyone knowing who he was. He said, "I needed to know if I was good at this on my own, before I walked in through the front door." I said, "How long were you planning to do that?" He said, "I don't know, until it felt true." I looked at him for a long time. I said, "Does it feel true yet?" He thought about it. He said, "It does now." I said, "Why now?" He said, "Because I know who I am outside of it, which means I know what I'm bringing in." I was quiet for a moment. I said, "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" He said, "Because I needed to know if you were with me, not with what my father built. I needed to know you saw me." I said, "I've seen you since October in a library." He said, "I know." He reached across the table. I took his hand. I said, "Your father wants to have dinner." He said, "He does. He's trying. We both are." I said, "Then we'll have dinner." He nodded. I said, "Also, you're getting the inspection sticker this week." He laughed. It was the best sound in the apartment. My 25th birthday fell on a Saturday in July. I had known since I was approximately 12 years old that my 25th birthday would be a production. My mother had been planning it with the same low-grade intensity she brought to all significant social events. Not overtly, but in the way certain things accumulate around you when your mother is a woman who treats milestones as performance opportunities. Audrey's 25th had been a dinner for 40 at a private club. Mine, my mother told me in March, would be at Loom. Loom, the 5-star restaurant in the converted textile building, the building owned by Elliot Ashworth. I registered this fact and sat with it for a moment. Then I decided, with the particular reasoning of a person who is still processing the scale of what they've learned, to let the evening be what it was going to be. I would bring Daniel, he would be there, whatever happened would happen. I told my mother I was bringing Daniel. Her response was a pause that lasted approximately 2 seconds and contained an entire dissertation. Then she said, "Of course, if that's what you want." The reservation was for 12. My parents, Audrey and Bryce, 2 of my mother's closest friends, Pamela and her husband Robert, my father's law partner, Neil, and his wife, Susan, my college friend Grace and her boyfriend, and Daniel. 12 people. My birthday, Loom. In the 2 weeks before the dinner, my mother did something I didn't know about until afterward. She called Pamela, who called her contact at the restaurant's management, and my mother, I cannot verify the exact wording, but the outcome tells me enough, conveyed her preferences regarding the guest list. She indicated in the polished, indirect language she used for this kind of thing that the evening should be elegant, and she wanted to ensure everyone at the table was comfortable. I found out about this later. I did not know on the night. What I did know, because Daniel told me, was that he had spoken to his father the week before the dinner. He told Elliot where we were. He told me about me properly for the first time, not a summary, but the real version, who I was, what we'd built over 14 months. Elliot apparently had gone quiet, in that way that means something. Then he had said, "I'd like to meet her." Daniel had said, "You will." I did not know that Elliot Ashworth had made a reservation at his own restaurant on the same Saturday evening. I did not know that he had a private suite on the second floor that he used for personal dining on the occasions he visited the property. I did not know that the restaurant manager, a man named Henry who had worked for Elliot for 9 years, knew exactly who Daniel Ashworth was, had known since the day Daniel first walked into Loom for a casual dinner 3 months after arriving in Charlotte, and said nothing to anyone because Elliot had asked him not to. I did not know any of this. On the night, I was just a woman turning 25, wearing a navy dress, arriving at a beautiful restaurant with the man I loved, hoping my mother would get through a single dinner without drawing blood. She did not get through the arrival. We arrived at 7:15. The dinner was at 7:30. I had asked Daniel to meet me there rather than driving together because I wanted 5 minutes with my mother before the full group assembled, hoping to set a tone. That was a miscalculation. My parents were already at the bar when I arrived, with Pamela and Robert. My mother was in red. She always wore red to important evenings. Her signature, the color of a woman who has decided she is the statement of the room. She kissed my cheeks, told me I looked beautiful, touched my hair. The warmth was real. My mother's love is real. That has never been the question. The question has always been what she does with the fear underneath it. My father hugged me. He smelled like his cologne and like the one scotch he always had before dinner. He said, 25! God help us. He was grinning. He was happy. This was genuine too. Audrey arrived with Bryce at 7:20. She looked at my dress and said,
"That's so you," which was Audrey speak for "I would have worn something different," and also, "I love you." I was watching the door. At 7:22, Daniel walked in. He was wearing a dark navy jacket, well-fitted, clean, simple. A white shirt underneath, open at the collar. He had gotten a haircut that week, I noticed. He looked not dressed up exactly, but present, like a person who has chosen to be exactly where they are. He saw me, and his face did the quiet thing I had come to love. Not a performance of happiness, but the actual thing, moving across his features like weather. He crossed the room toward me. My mother saw him before he reached me. I watched her face. The read happened in under 2 seconds. The jacket, the open collar, the absence of a tie, the car that was presumably somewhere in the valet queue, the 4-year-old Honda that had, I would find out later, been handed to the valet with the same unhurried courtesy Daniel brought to everything. No apology, no comment. The absence, in my mother's accounting, of the right signals. She stepped forward. And here is the thing about Catherine Voss that I need you to understand before I tell you what she said. She is not a monster. She is a woman who was taught deeply and early that the world was arranged in a certain order, and that navigating that order successfully was the highest form of care she could provide her children. She genuinely believed in that moment that what she was about to do was protective. She believed it was love. She stepped between Daniel and me. She said, "Daniel, what a surprise." He said, "Mrs. Voss, happy birthday to Serena." She tilted her head slightly. Her voice dropped to the register she used for private corrections. Not a whisper, but not public either. The voice of someone drawing a boundary and calling it a favor. She said, "I think, given the setting tonight and the guests we have," she paused, "this might not be the right environment for you. I want everyone to be comfortable." She said, "This isn't the right setting for you, sweetheart." That last word, sweetheart, the softener that made the blade easier to insert. She said it with the door at his back, not pointing, not raised, just oriented toward it, like a compass needle orients. The implication was architecture. The bar had quieted slightly. Pamela had heard. Robert had heard. My father was looking at his scotch. Daniel looked at my mother. He did not flush. He did not look away. He did not become smaller. He just looked at her with those steady eyes and said very quietly, "I understand." He looked at me. His face said, "Are you okay?" I was not okay. I was vibrating with a specific fury that I had spent 25 years learning to keep below the surface. The fury of watching someone you love be reduced, while the reducer calls it decorum. I said, "Daniel, you're not—" My mother touched my arm, the touch that means, "Not here, not now, I'll explain." And Daniel, who had spent a year and a half being exactly who he was without requiring anyone to acknowledge it, said to me, "It's all right, I'll wait." He said it to my mother, "I hope you all have a lovely evening." He walked toward the entrance. He did not look like someone who had been defeated. He looked like someone who knew something everyone else in the room didn't. At the time, I didn't understand why. 60 seconds later, I did. The dining room at Loom is the kind of room that makes you understand why architecture matters. The original textile looms had been preserved along the ceiling, 20-foot wooden frames. The machines that had once run cloth, now dramatic structural art. The light was warm and low. The tables were spaced with the generosity of a restaurant that doesn't need to maximize covers. There were flowers, not as centerpieces, but as a scent in the air, something botanical and faint that you registered before you could identify it. It was, as Charlotte restaurants went, extraordinary. My mother had led us to the table and was in the process of the subtle social orchestration she excelled at, placing people where they would be most useful to the evening's narrative, when it happened. Henri. The restaurant manager was a compact Frenchman in his late 40s, silver at his temples, who carried himself with the complete authority of a person who has run excellent rooms for a long time. He was not the kind of manager who managed from a distance. He moved through the floor the way water moves around stones, presently, purposefully, always exactly where he needed to be. He had, apparently, been at the host station when Daniel arrived. He had seen Daniel being redirected toward the door. He had waited approximately 45 seconds, perhaps to be certain of what he had observed, perhaps out of the particular professionalism of a man who does not act impulsively in his own dining room. Then he had spoken quietly to a member of his staff, and then he had walked toward our table. The room was mid-conversation when he arrived. My mother was speaking to Pamela. My father was pouring water. I was watching the entrance with one eye, willing Daniel to come back in, waiting for a moment when I could excuse myself and go to him without creating a scene. Henri stopped at our table. He said, "Good evening. I am Henri. I want to welcome you to Loom and ensure your evening is everything it should be." My mother looked up. She knew Henri. She had dined here 4 times previously and had cultivated this familiarity with the care she brought to all social assets. She said, "Henri, wonderful to see you. The table is just as we hoped." He thanked her, and then he said, "I believe there may have been a misunderstanding at the entrance this evening." My mother's expression shifted, a quarter turn, barely perceptible. He said, "I noticed a young man stepping outside, dark jacket, navy. He arrived with your party, I believe." My mother said, "He decided the evening wasn't quite his." Henri said, "I want to make sure you're aware." He paused. The room seemed to hold. He said, "His father is waiting for him in the private suite upstairs." Silence. He said, "Mr. Elliot Ashworth, he reserved the suite this evening specifically to meet the family." He looked at my mother. He said, "I wanted to ensure, of course, that his son had been welcomed appropriately." He said it with the complete, serene professionalism of a man who has never once raised his voice and has never needed to. Then he straightened slightly, inclined his head with a courtesy that was directed, precisely, unmistakably, past my mother and toward the entrance where Daniel was standing just inside the door, having apparently been asked to wait by a member of Henri's staff. He said to Daniel across the room, with a bow that was small and genuine and completely devastating, "Sir, your father is waiting." My mother's wineglass slipped, crystal on marble. The sound was total. Some moments have a before and after that you can locate precisely. The sound of that glass hitting the floor, not shattering but cracking, a clean fracture, was one of those moments. My mother's face did something I had never seen it do. Not embarrassment exactly, something deeper, the particular expression of a person whose operating system has encountered information it was not designed to process, and the screen has gone briefly, completely white. She looked at Henri. She looked at Daniel, who was walking back into the room with the same unhurried step he walked into every room. She looked at me. I looked back at her. I kept my face still. I had learned to keep my face still from watching my mother do it for 25 years, which was, in the circumstances, a particular irony. Pamela said, "Elliot Ashworth?" in the tone of a woman doing rapid social arithmetic. Robert said nothing, but straightened in his chair. My father set down his water glass with a care that suggested he was also processing rapidly and had decided the safest move was stillness. Audrey said, "Wait," and then stopped. Bryce said nothing. Bryce was recalibrating faster than anyone at the table. I could see it on his face. The specific recalibration of a man in finance who has just understood that he has been condescending to the heir of Ashworth Group at family dinners for 8 months. Daniel reached the table. He was not cold to her. He was not warm. He was precisely what the situation required. Courteous, measured. The manner of a man who had been in business long enough to know that burning bridges was almost always less useful than keeping them intact for later use.
My mother understood that manner. The coordinates my mother used to calibrate people had been rearranged, and she was navigating without her usual GPS, and everyone at the table could feel it, even if nobody said so. My father, to his credit, leaned into it. He asked Elliot genuine questions about development projects, about the direction of Charlotte's waterfront, about a rezoning proposal he'd been following as a lawyer. Elliot answered with the straightforward substance of a man who likes talking about his work. By the second course, they were in the middle of a real conversation, the kind men have when they've stopped performing and started thinking. I watched this and felt, for the first time in a long time, something I could only describe as relief. Audrey was quiet most of the evening, not cold, just recalibrated. I watched her watching Daniel and understood something. She had spent 8 months fitting him into the category her mother had assigned him, and now the category was gone, and she didn't know what to build in its place yet. That work was hers to do, not mine. Bryce talked to Daniel for 20 minutes about Ashworth Group's commercial development arm. I caught Daniel's eye once during the conversation. He gave me one that said, "This is fine, I'm used to it." I gave him one that said, "You're very patient." He gave one back that said, "You have no idea." I put my hand on his under the table. He turned his hand over and held mine. Grace, bless her, made a toast at the dessert course. She stood up with her wine glass and said, "To Serena, who somehow made it to 25 without once doing anything the expected way, and to Daniel, who I just met tonight and who I think is exactly the right kind of trouble." There was laughter around the table, real laughter, the kind that comes from a room that has been through something and is on the other side of it. Even my mother lifted her glass. Elliot smiled. Daniel looked at me and said quietly, just to me, "Happy birthday, Serena." I said, "This is not what I expected for my 25th. He said, "Is that okay?" I looked at the room. My father and Elliot, now talking about the waterfront. Grace, who had been my friend since freshman year, refilling her wine glass with the ease of someone completely comfortable in an uncomfortable situation. Henry, at the edge of the floor, watching the room with quiet satisfaction. My mother, who was listening to something Pamela said, and whose profile in the candlelight looked not diminished because Catherine Voss did not diminish, but somehow softer, something slightly returned to earth. I said, "It's better than okay." He said, "Good." He squeezed my hand. The dessert arrived. The dinner ended at 10:30. In the car going home, my mother was quiet for a long time. That was unusual. Catherine Voss filled spaces. Silence from her was always a sign of interior weather. My father drove. He had the radio on low, something classical that he chose without comment. After about 15 minutes, my mother said, "I owe Daniel an apology." My father said, "Yes." She said, "I handled the entrance poorly." My father said, "You did." Another silence. She said, "I thought I was protecting you." I said, "I know." I said, "Mom, I know you thought that, and I need you to understand something. The things you were protecting me from, the criteria, the coordinates, the measuring, they don't protect me. They just teach me to see people the way you see them, and I don't want to see people that way." She was quiet. I said, "Daniel is the best person I have been in a room with. That was true before I knew who his father was, and it will be true if his father's entire business went away tomorrow. The rest of it doesn't change who he is." She said, "I know that now." I said, "You knew it before, you just decided not to." She didn't answer. My father reached over and put his hand briefly on her knee, a small gesture, a long marriage condensed into a touch. The rest of the drive was quiet. The next day, my mother called Daniel. I wasn't present for the call. He told me about it afterwards, briefly, because Daniel doesn't over-process things. He said she apologized. A real apology, not the social kind that is really a self-explanation, an actual one. He said she was gracious. He said, "She loves you. It came out wrong, but it came from love." I said,
"That's very generous of you." He said, "I've had time to practice being generous about parents." I thought about his father and the 4 years of complicated, and the year in Charlotte learning from the ground up, and the 10 minutes at a gallery opening. I said, "How are things with Elliot?" He said, "Better. We had breakfast this morning." I said, "That's good." He said, "He likes you." He said... He paused with a small smile that was becoming one of my favorite things about him. He said, "You looked at him like you were deciding something and that he found it refreshing." I laughed. I said, "I was deciding something." He said, "What?" I said, "Whether he deserved you, whether all the complicated had been worth the cost on both sides." He said, "And?" I said, "I think you're both doing the work. That's all you can ask." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Thank you for that." I said, "Don't thank me. I'm just paying attention." He said, "You've always paid attention." And that was the thing, finally, that I understood most clearly about the whole evening. Not the glass wine, not Henri's bow, not the recalibration of 12 people around a table. The thing that mattered was something that had been true since October, in a library, when a man with steady eyes picked up my books without being asked, and read their titles and didn't perform anything. He was exactly who he was. He had always been exactly who he was. The measuring instruments my family used would never have found him, because what he was made of wasn't measurable that way. It is 8 months since the birthday dinner. Daniel and Elliot have breakfast every 2 weeks now, sometimes 3. The complicated is not resolved. These things don't resolve like equations. They evolve, they shift, they become something livable. But the distance has closed. Daniel joined Ashworth Group officially in the fall, in a director-level role in development that he had, by every measure, earned. Not because of his last name, because of 19 months of ground-level work that his colleagues still don't know was done by the founder's son. He told his team the week he was promoted. He told them directly, without making it large. He said, "I should have said this earlier. I have a last name some of you will recognize. I wanted to earn this role first. I hope that makes sense." He told me one of his colleagues said, "We figured it out about 4 months in. We didn't say anything because you were clearly better at this when you didn't know we knew." He told me this and laughed, that laugh that fills an apartment before it fills a room. I love that laugh. My mother has, in the months since, made a sustained effort, not a transformed effort. Catherine Voss is who she is, and the coordinates are still in her operating system, still running in the background, but a corrected one. She had Daniel and me for dinner in September at the house, the 2 of them in the kitchen while she cooked, and what I observed from the doorway was a conversation happening without the machinery of assessment, just 2 people talking. It was a start. My father plays golf with Elliot now, once a month. I don't know what they talk about. I suspect some of it is business, and some of it is their children, and some of it is golf, and some of it is the particular conversation 2 men have when they are both trying to understand each other without saying so. Audrey called me in October. She said, "I'm sorry I never stood up for you at the entrance. I should have." I said, "You didn't know what to do." She said, "That's not an excuse." I said, "No, but it's a reason. There's a difference." She was quiet. She said, "He's good for you." I said, "I know." She said, "I can see why now. I couldn't before. I was looking at the wrong things." I said, "Yeah." She said, "How do you stop doing that?" I said, "You start looking at the right things. It takes practice, but you start by noticing when you're using someone else's measuring stick and putting it down." She said, "That's harder than it sounds." I said, "Everything good is harder than it sounds." Grace was my maid of honor. I should have said that differently. Daniel proposed in November, standing in the kitchen of his Noda apartment, which was also now my apartment, with no audience and no production, just the 2 of us, and the light from the window, and a ring he had designed himself. Simple, an architect's ring. A single stone set in a clean band,
and the question asked the way he asked everything, quietly, directly, with complete confidence in the answer. I said yes before he finished the sentence. We are getting married in April. Elliot is paying for the venue. My father is paying for everything else. My mother has already proposed Loom for the rehearsal dinner. I said, Mom, are you serious? She said, Henri has a wonderful private suite. She said it with a smile that for the first time I could not find the blade in. I said, book it. My grandmother, my mother's mother, a woman named Frances who lived to 91 and grew roses and had opinions about everything, used to say, what a person is made of doesn't show up in what they're wearing. My mother had heard this her whole life. She had spent decades not believing it. The thing about measuring sticks is that they feel like safety. If you can measure a person quickly, their car, their collar, their school, their address, you can categorize them quickly. And categorization feels like control, and control feels like protection. It is the architecture of a certain kind of anxiety. If I know everyone's rank, nothing can surprise me. But rank is not character. Category is not substance. The address a person comes from tells you about the circumstances of their birth. It tells you nothing about who they became. Daniel came to Charlotte in a 4-year-old Honda and a well-loved jacket and lived in a 1-bedroom apartment and took the bus to gallery openings because he needed to know what he was made of when stripped of everything his father had built. And what he was made of turned out to be the same thing in every room, at every table, in every circumstance. That is rare. That is not measurable by any instrument my family owns. On the night of my birthday, the wine glass hit the floor, and something else hit the floor with it. Not my mother's dignity, she kept that, she always keeps that, but the certainty that she knew how to read a room. That certainty needed to break. It was making her smaller than she actually was, more rigid than she had to be, less able to see clearly the people who were right in front of her. I am not grateful for what she did that night at the entrance. I want to be honest about that. What she did was cruel, even if it was cruel in the language of concern. Daniel deserved better. He was gracious about it, because grace is what he is made of. But he deserved better. What I am grateful for is the correction. What I am grateful for is Henri's bow and the sound of crystal on marble and the way 12 people sat around a table that night and had to look at each other more honestly than they had planned to. And I'm grateful that the man I'm marrying is someone I met before I knew his last name in a library on a Tuesday when he picked up my books without being asked and read the titles with genuine curiosity and said nothing more complicated than, "You're thorough." He is still thorough. So am I. It turns out that is the only measuring stick we need. That's my story. A birthday dinner, a wine glass on a marble floor, a man who was exactly who he was in every room, waiting for the room to catch up, and a family that slowly, imperfectly, in the way real families do it, is learning to look at the right things. If someone has measured you against the wrong standard and found you lacking, take this as your sign that the instrument was broken, not you. Drop a comment. I read every single one. Hit subscribe if this found you at the right moment, and I'll see you in the next one.